Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for sacrificing your early Friday evening for this talk. I know Friday evening is a precious time, and I am very honoured to be standing among you all and to share my thoughts on libraries and museums. When Helen, who as she says I've known for a very long time, invited me to come here today, I felt that it was very timely because I have reflected on the similarities and the differences, the pleasures and the pains of working in both types of institution in over 30 years in these two great London collections. And I think it is true to say that inside every great museum, like the V&A, which will always be so dear to my heart and I'm sure is familiar to almost everyone in this room, inside every great museum there is a library trying to get out. And I do think that similarly, inside every list of objects, list of things, there is this notion of category and subject matter in an organised fashion. Here we are in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, a library of the physical world, if ever there was one. And when we look at some of the images that I have to share with you today, you will find many instances of buildings which were designed as libraries, but are now seen more as museums. And as in the case of the King's Library in the British Museum, buildings which were originally designed as libraries and changed into museums. This was the library designed for King George III's books. It held those books for a century and a half, and then it changed its function and it became a place of display for the physical world when the British Museum Enlightenment Galleries opened up. So this talk is rather idiosyncratic, and I hope that you'll bear with me. I'm going to begin with some personal memories. I'm then going to have a look at some great libraries of the world, and I hope that you will agree with me that there are features in common. I'm going to say a few things about museums and libraries and some thoughts on how they complement and enhance each other, and I'm going to conclude with a bit of a roundup of how at the V&A in the last 3 or 4 years we've been planning a different way of using museum collections in future, and particularly in facing the challenges of those collections which are not accessed by museum visitors. As I talk, the difference between a library which exists to serve people who come to it with a purpose and a museum which is a place of beneficial learning and education in a context of leisure for the majority of its visitors. That great difference in primary purpose, I think, will shine through the different places and experiences I talk about, and I hope that in the conversation afterwards, and I do please entreat you to ask questions and to talk afterwards and to challenge my views. I hope that when we talk afterwards, we might take some of my tentative observations a little further. So, my early library experiences were in Glasgow as an undergraduate in the late 60s. And this great modern tower had just opened and was beginning to be filled with books. Here's the old library in the Glasgow quadrangles being emptied and the books being shifted across to their new headquarters. And here is my first encounter with a professional librarian. These librarians wore white coats. I can remember them vividly. They were knowledgeable, efficient, and helpful. I felt terribly ill-equipped as an undergraduate to access the collections which were there for me, and I certainly felt rather overawed and rather ill at ease. Then, after my Glasgow years, I moved down to Cambridge And here you can see the 1930s construction to my right, and the completed building to the left there. And that's the Cambridge University Library. I was an undergraduate in Chinese studies, and at my disposal was a college library, a faculty library, the university library, these three different resources. Great riches, and again a sense of almost overwhelming provision, which was hard to take the best out of. And reflecting on my Cambridge years, I thought often of how sad it was that the most famous Chinese studies enterprise out of the University of Cambridge, the great Science and Civilization series, which has given birth to the Needham Institute for the History of Science in China, that institute was completely closed off to me in those Cold War years, because Professor Needham was of the left, and most Chinese studies people were not particularly politically sympathetic, and the two wings just didn't really communicate. And so that great enterprise going on in Cambridge really was a parallel world. And that's, I think, a great lack in the libraries of those days, which has, to an extent, been overcome by the digital era, which we'll talk about later in my career. The digital opening of resources has made it much harder for different specializations to stay sequestered from each other. After Cambridge, I was a British Council scholar in China for a couple of years, and this is Peking University Library. It's a little bit later than my time. I'm afraid I couldn't find an image from those years. That was a library experience like no other. It was a time of ideological campaigns, and the Cultural Revolution was still strident and dominated university life. I was studying history, and I was interested in the history of the Tang dynasty, which runs from the 7th to the 10th century AD. At that time, there was only one politically approved approach to Tang dynasty history that could be permitted in Chinese universities, and that was the study of exemplary female rulers in the Tang period. Why? Because Chairman Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, was angling for political power, and she had cherry-picked a number of female rulers for the past as exemplars of the ability of women to play a dominant role in political life. And if one didn't want to study that particular topic, really there was nothing more to be said. And I have vivid memories of going up to the lending desk in the university library, asking for a book, the staff consulting a little card catalogue and coming back to tell me that it wasn't available. And that was a disappointing time, and one which I think slightly interrupted my studies. So that was Peking University Library. Then in the 80s, I began to work in the British Library, which at that time had already separated from the British Museum, but was still cohabiting in the Bloomsbury building. And I think many of you will recognise the famous round reading room, seen here with its laid down catalogues, supervised by a central librarian, and with all the readers' desks around. In more recent times, this room looks like this. So perhaps I just go back. You can see the clock up there. You can orientate yourself, and then there's the clock there. And you'll see how this room has changed, how now, at this level, there's a new floor of the museum behind, and how the card catalogues have gone away. And this room was used for a while as a resource centre, and then it became an exhibition gallery, and now it's awaiting a new life in the British Museum. Now it's closed to the public. So the design of the building is a very practical feature. distinguishing one kind of institution from another. And the British Museum has tried to use this room as an exhibition space, but overall, I think, felt that it wasn't particularly well designed for that use. The great mid-19th century librarian Antonio Panizzi was, of course, the driving force behind the creation of the British Museum Reading Room, and he was aware of the inadequacies of this space in the King's Library and moved on to create this marvellous domed structure in the central courtyard of the British Museum with its fantastic ironwork bookshelves, which I can remember vividly and which are no more. They were removed when the library eventually had to move up to the St Pancras building. So, moving up to St Pancras in the 1990s, one began to feel that libraries really were changing very, very fundamentally. Among my colleagues, there were very sharp divisions of opinion about how the library of the future would work. And in particular, there were quite strongly articulated views that this structure was going to be a great big failure because the internet would make it redundant. And it was a foolish enterprise to be creating such a massive and costly new National Library. Well, instinctively I felt that that wasn't correct, and there were a number of rather brilliant colleagues like Andrew Prescott and Graham Jeffcott, who articulated the potential of the digital technology to spread and deepen scholarship while retaining respect for and engagement with the physical collections around which that scholarship grew up. And when you're in the thick of all this kind of work, it's hard to know which way it's going to go, but I believe that history has vindicated the optimists, and that the British Library and other great national libraries are busier, fuller and richer in their work today than we could have imagined back in the 90s when we were setting them up. So it's been almost 20 years since the British Library opened in 1998, and if you compare the performance of the facilities and the collections with the scenarios that were being outlined then, one really has to say that it's gone better and faster and wider than we had ever imagined. The former British Museum Reading Room had a restricted readership and was a place which was quite daunting to gain access to. Nowadays, as I'm sure you're all aware, the main complaint is that the new British Library is too democratic. It's too relaxed in the opportunities that it offers, and that serious scholars sometimes struggle to find a place to work. So let me just. So the great King's Library in the centre of the British Library again is, I think, an instance of this respect for and focus on the physical collections, surrounded by, of course, people who are working online. You know that central library was inspired by an earlier 1960s library tower, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and that I think library buildings do have this ability to engender new ideas and new ways of showing collections, and to draw successive generations of scholars and librarians and the general public, all three categories of which are important, into love for and respect for historic collections. So there we are in the British Museum with the Great Court, with the round reading room now represented, minus its book stacks. Sorry, this is not good. This is a little bit too small. But let me just, although that picture is not quite complete, a few words about my work at the British Library and the British Library's Chinese collections. This is the frontispiece to the Diamond Sutra of 868 AD. This is the world's earliest dated printed book, and it is in the British Library's collections. And I was very fortunate in the 10 years or so that I worked on the British Library's Chinese collections to have the chance to look after, study, and disseminate knowledge about this collection of Chinese manuscripts, the Stein collection, which had come from Central Asia to London in the early 20th century. This collection of manuscripts is rivaled in Europe only by the French Pelliot collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale. It is a privilege and a weight and a burden to take care of such a great treasury of world civilization. And my colleagues and I were always conscious of the international opinion about such an international collection being held in London. But what we could do, when we could not alter the historical circumstances of the past, what we certainly could do was to take better care of these collections than had been the case before we arrived. We were linguistically trained to deal with Chinese collections. We had conservators and scholars around us, and we were able to take advantage of the thawing relationship between China and the West to spark off some innovative scholarship, both digital and print, to help those collections to be better cared for. So these are all library thoughts. And before I leave libraries, a quick look through some remarkable library buildings which caught my attention as I was thinking of this subject. First of all, in Alexandria, the early 21st century Alexandria Library. It is a remarkable fact, I think, that in our modern age, the great library of antiquity should be recreated despite the troubled circumstances of the surrounding lands, and that it persists and it continues to function, and that it contains both modern and historic collections. So that, I think, is a remarkable world achievement. Other great libraries that we might think about find their origin either in a religious idea, as in the Sistine Library in the Vatican, the Counter-Reformation, the Escorial. Across Eastern and Northern Europe, the desire, I think, to give proper honour and respect to ancient collections, often in church circumstances, in church buildings, which over many years have been destroyed or have been damaged, and as in these Baroque buildings I'm showing you here in Switzerland, in Prague, and in Germany, reimagined and represented for a later age, with the taste of that later age, but above all with respect and a sort of framing which speaks of the precious and valuable nature of the collections. Here we're at the Château de Chantilly, where in the mid-19th century the owner of the chateau had it completely renovated, including an ironwork library like that in London. And here we've crossed the ocean to Baltimore, where the Peabody Library was set up in the mid-19th century with this glorious 5-story building, and still today remains a source of local pride and is still consulted as a working library. The Library of Congress, a kind of icon of American idealism, close to the Capitol building, close to the centre of power, and still again visited and respected today. In Melbourne, the 5-storey domed central reading room built in the early 20th century. So all across the world, the sense that as cities grew, as populations expanded their ambitions of education and self-realization, a library would be at the center of it. And here we are finally in Salt Lake City, where in the early 21st century, the library there was reconstructed and designed by the Canadian architect Moshe Safdie. The libraries then have found their position and their centrality in modern urban life particularly. But what about museums which, despite their success in gathering in greater audiences, despite their great exhibition success and the large rates of participation in the programs that they offer, what about museums which continue to have vast assemblages of collections which are not easily available to the public? And I've got a couple of examples from the V&A, including this magnificent 1930s room set by Frank Lloyd Wright, which was acquired by the V&A in the 1970s and has been in storage for all but a few years of that time, of the time since. Now, these are really difficult questions because unlike a book or a digital file, which can be relatively conveniently handed over to an inquirer, this room set requires thousands of pounds of space and skilled technician time to assemble it in such a way that somebody can make sense of it and look at it and examine it. And here's another example. This is a 15th century ceiling from a great mansion in Toledo in Spain. And again, it was on display in the V&A in what is now, I think, the Raphael Court, and that came off display in the 1980s, and it has been in storage ever since. It's massive. It's about 3 meters square, and it's one of the most beautiful objects I have ever seen. But it sits in a store, and to present it to an interested scholar is a pretty kind of heavy task for anybody to undertake. So museums have to look. Museums have things in common with libraries. They have this quest to assemble knowledge and to build it for the future. They have the sense of accessibility to visitors and the sense of expertise in collection care. All of these are museums and libraries' common features. But where the atmosphere of the special collections room in a library and the protection from danger, the awareness of the value of the collection is very apparent to many members of the scholarly community, I think it tends to be art historians, historians of sculpture, historians of architecture, who find it very frustrating that the physical remnants of the material world are now distant from them and often inconvenient in their way of being consulted. So here's the V&A's library, one of 3 or 4 major facilities the V&A can offer to the public to research those things which can be researched easily. Prints, photographs, books, pieces of textiles which have been well encased and so on. These are the simple parts. The difficult things are the larger and more awkward and expensive ones. I want to say a few words about the Barnes collection in Philadelphia before I move on to talk about the V&A's work. I think that when we consider museums and libraries in the British Isles, we sometimes forget just how lucky we are to have so much in the public domain. If we, by contrast, were mainly engaging with privately owned and privately designed collections, we would have some different practices and some different experiences. And the Barnes collection is the one which always stands out in my mind because of the great eccentricity of its founders' points of view. This wonderful painting, the Matisse Bonheur de Vivre, was hardly known to art historians for many, many years while Mr. Barnes himself was still alive, because number one, he didn't approve of colour images of his collection being circulated, and number two, he didn't really particularly want general visitors to come and see his collection. One had to apply in person, and if he decided that he wasn't particularly impressed by you, he would simply refuse to let you see the collection. And that kind of private ownership and lack of entitlement to collections is so far away from the experience of many members of the general public that we sometimes forget that the view that we have of art historical collections is a partial one, and that there is a vast body of material not available for us to see, possibly previously on display and then moved into storage, or in some cases privately owned and not circulated. So we talk and assume always that we're talking about public collections, but the volume of data that we have to deal with stretches from the public to the privately owned, and perhaps this is where only digital resources can help us to bridge the gap. Now I move off from the earlier part of my talk and give you a little bit of an insight into the newly formed V&A Research Institute. The V&A was a very innovative museum right from the outset. Its foundation after the Great Exhibition of 1851 was a personal ambition, a personal cause of Prince Albert, and he and his fellow commissioners had great future-facing ideas, and they were very, very ahead of their time, and they made sure that the V&A, or the South Kensington Museum as it then was, did things differently from the other museums that they knew. I won't read through all these points, you can see them. But the V&A, I think, can be proud of quite a lot of the things it did first. It was indeed the first museum in Britain to have a restaurant, and the first to introduce artificial lighting and evening opening, all driven by the desire to attract the working person, probably the working man in all honesty, to the museum, and the awareness that during the working day it would be difficult. Photography wasn't really thought of as a particularly useful art back then, but the V&A set up a photography studio before other museums did so. And later, in the 20th century, the way in which research inside the museum was organised was different in the V&A compared to our peers in other museums, both in the UK and overseas, in that a separate centre for research was set up in the 1980s, and the practice of inviting visiting fellows and creating alliances with universities flourished at the V&A, I think, long in advance of the current practice of collaborative doctoral awards and other joint university museum projects. This kind of enterprise has been underway at the V&A for many decades now. So what does the V&A have to offer this research institute which we are planning to set up? And I should say it's only a matter of naming, I suppose, but it's a move from a research department, which is one of several departments in the museum, to a research institute with a higher profile and a greater ambition. So we have a very large number of curators in the V&A, and you can see the different specialisations that they have. And we have a very large number of objects as well. So there's a big community ready to work in collaboration with our colleagues in the university sphere. what kind of things have we been doing to date that offer a foundation for future research-based museum work with a public outcome? Well, sorry, let me go back to this. Currently, there's an exhibition entitled Opus Anglicanum, which is being presented in the V&A galleries. For that exhibition, there was an AHRC-funded doctoral award, and there has been subvention from Yale for the publication of the catalogue. And the whole mechanism for developing the exhibition has been collaborative and open. Likewise, when last year's highly successful McQueen exhibition was shown, that was the outcome of work between the V&A and the London College of Fashion, where one of our curators was a visiting professor at the college, and there were many, many interactions between museum specialists and university specialists and others too. So that all comes together as an enrichment for the curatorial and programming process. As well as these high-profile exhibition-focused enterprises, we also have a number of interesting individuals who will be working in a fairly specialised environment for a long time, and whose work may not be seen by the general public perhaps for several years, could be for 4 or 5 years. But in the end, there will always be a public outcome. And Cher is one of these, who is working on particularly digital technologies and fashion and design in Africa, a subject which the V&A has rather disgracefully ignored over the years, with an excessive focus on Europe and Asia. So we're going to try to write that, and we're going to try to move straight into 21st century African design and technology. We also have a more traditional cabinets of curiosities kind of focus, led by a young scholar who's visiting us long term and working on cabinets of curiosity. Lisa Scoe has been leading that side of things. And then a third example, and these, I don't read anything into these examples. We have many, many research fellows that I could mention, but this is just a third one, Professor Guy Julier, whose work on the social interactions of design processes is well respected, well networked around the UK, and the fact that he's embedded inside the V&A helps us to draw from his research new designs that we can take forward. The research department already publishes in the way that you see here. These are the sorts of things, including the online journal, the conservation journal, and various conference papers. And it has now articulated the following 3 aims for a future institute. Collection activation, fundamentally trying to resolve this knotty problem of how to allow greater public access to those parts of the collection which are not on view, how to be more focused on the way things are made, make process more apparent to the visitor, and how to draw out of museum work and success insights which can inform public policy. This is just a look back over some of the things which have been done over the years along these lines, because I think it's fair to say that this is not a new insight. I think there have always been museum visitors and museum thinkers who have wanted to bring some of these ideas forward. And here you can see some of the V&A history, which refers back to this ideal of more openness and more interaction. The Government School of Design preceded the foundation of the V&A in 1851 and was part of the great universalisation of education in Britain. The evening hours we've mentioned earlier. The whole notion of replicas of great works of art being available to museum visitors can range from photography to the great casts in the V&A's great cast courts, to electroplating, which was a great Victorian technique to make replicas of metalwork objects. Then the V&A had this wonderful thing called the circulation department, which was a group of people whose job it was to run circulating exhibitions around the UK. And that ran extremely smoothly and profitably for all concerned for very, very many years, for over a century, I think, about a century. Then this program here was part of setting up makers in the Raphael court, and it was possible just to wander in and watch people making things as long ago as in the 1970s. The other examples there include a kind of very participative embroidery project, which coincided with the opening of the Indian galleries back in the 90s. The British galleries, telling the story of British art and design from 1500 to 1900, were extremely innovative in the way that they brought hands-on educational experiences into the museum visit. Nowadays, that's absolutely mainstream and nobody thinks twice of it. But back then, it was a pretty revolutionary new innovation. The factory was a great project to try to mass digitize the hundreds of thousands of prints and drawings, for which there were only, copies in drawers and difficult to get them out on the internet. And the Clothworkers Centre is probably our most recent one, where our textiles have been moved into custom-made facilities in West London, where they are both stored and conserved and consulted in a convenient and properly designed manner. So all of these things have been very good. But they still leave us with hundreds of thousands of unseen objects in the stores. And when the Olympic Park in East London was being talked about, there was always the sense that after the Games in 2012, the land surrounding that area would undergo a massive change in its use and its profile. And so we have this, where is it? Here. We have this waterway going up here, and if I'm correct, this is the aquatic centre. This is the swimming building designed by Zaha Hadid, and this area here is designated for a brand new London Cultural Centre, including a new V&A. And that is going to be a fantastic opportunity for us to help the public to engage with our collections differently and to take our collections to where the people are, because it's very clear that West London is well provided with cultural infrastructure and East London is not. And so as a 21st century extension of V&A innovation, I think this is an entirely good move. So the Research Institute is not only about the Olympic Park, it's about the whole of the way the V&A will work in future, but the Olympic Park will help to get it sparked and get it going. The following things: collections, curatorial expertise, conservation and collection science, the exhibition programme, teaching and training, that's basically running postgraduate courses for students and so forth, and working in partnership with the universities and creative industries, and greatly increasing the number of resident artists and designers that we are able to host in the museum. All of these things will come on stream after the new building in East London is built, and the programming directions will be in three parts. The lab is the notion of, the lab here is the notion of delivering access to the way in which museums work, because it has appeared to us from our understanding of our visitors that people want to join in. They don't simply want to passively consume what we offer them, they want to be part, they want to offer a voice, they want to have a dialogue with us as we work. Very technical teaching and training, we feel that not only in the academic sphere but also in many trades and professions to do with museum work, to do with the ability to do art handling, the ability to do digitization, the ability to help with design and to walk up through a ladder of training to become a museum professional. In many areas, we can deliver much more than we currently do. And so that very technique will help in that area. And then the publications, I think we're all clear that print publication for art historical subjects is a difficult enterprise to take forward in an area of constrained funding. However, a certain amount of print publishing there will be, and probably the majority of our collections dissemination will be digital publishing in future. Oops, sorry, have I gone? So, here's kind of things that we might be doing in teaching and training. My colleague, Professor Bill Sherman, who's leading this work, is very keen on finding this word polytechnic and giving it new life. And polytechnic, the sense of many skills and many techniques, is probably something that we can address ourselves with and get moving. Higher education is self-evident, but the ability to welcome more students and scholars, the ability to open up the training that we can give to more people in future is going to be a major test for our work. These are our artists in residence showing some of the work that they have been doing in past years. And this is the Mellon-funded work which we've been doing. The test bed for the new research institute has been a one-year trial project with Mellon funding focusing on textiles and working at the Clothworkers Centre that I mentioned earlier. And here you see some of our great brains attempting to do a little bit of gentle sewing, which was an interesting exercise to watch. So that is the way in which we think that the V&A Research Institute will develop in future. And I hope that you can draw from what I've talked about libraries as well as museums, the sense in which the kind of pleasures that a scholar can take from direct access with perhaps an archive or a rare book can also be delivered to members of the public in a different kind of museum in future. We're still going through a process which will be a work in progress for a couple of years yet. We're in year one of the 5-year Mellon programme, but I think that both library and museum will benefit from the efforts that we will make. And for those of you who are interested in a library inside a museum, I would encourage you to watch out for a project whose name is Digital Dickens, because I guess very few people know that the greatest collection of Dickens manuscripts in the world is in the V&A, and that will be crowdsourced and transcribed thanks to the efforts of this Mellon project. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.